If you don't transfer $30,000 tonight, those men outside will come into the house and teach you a lesson. My father said that right in the living room of the house where I grew up. Out on the driveway, 3 men stood beside a black pickup truck, as if they were waiting for a signal. I had just gotten home from work when my parents pulled me down into a chair at the table. Within a few minutes, they started talking about a debt and why only I could solve it. But there was one thing my father didn't know. Right behind his shoulder, on the bookshelf in the living room, there was a small security camera. I was the one who installed it. And in just a few minutes, that camera would tear apart the entire story he was trying to build. And that is the story of Evelyn Bennett. If it were you, would you trust your family or trust your instinct? I'm Lisa. Before I continue Evelyn's story, I want to ask you something small. What state or city are you watching this video from? Leave a comment below. I always like seeing the different places where this story is being heard. If you enjoy stories about real life like this, please hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next videos. After I got off work at the office, my mother called and told me to come home right away. I thought my father just needed help looking over some paperwork again, like always. But the moment I walked in, I knew something was wrong tonight. The living room curtains were closed. My father stood close to the window, gripping his phone. My mother set a plate of food on the table, but didn't sit down. She just stood behind my chair with a kitchen towel in her hand. I hadn't even taken off my coat when my father said he was in trouble. An old debt. A few men outside were waiting for money. He said it all strangely smoothly, as if he had prepared the story in advance. I looked through the glass. 3 men stood beside a black pickup truck out in the driveway, silent, like they were waiting for a signal. My father turned back around. His voice dropped so low it was almost just breath. If you transfer $30,000 right now, this will all be over. I set my purse on the chair and looked toward the bookshelf next to the fireplace. A tiny green light was blinking in the dark. That was the camera I had installed myself. If it were you, what would you do in that situation? Leave a comment before the story continues. I stood next to the dining table, looking from my father to my mother. The room was so quiet that no one dared speak loudly. My father told me about an old business partner, a failed investment, and a debt that had to be paid that very night. He gave too much detail, far too much. I pulled out a chair and sat down, taking off my coat and draping it over the back. If they wanted me to believe them, the least they could do was let me ask questions. "What company was it, Dad?" I asked, keeping my voice as calm as I could. He answered right away. "What was the name of the contract?" He answered that immediately too. "When did you sign it?" The answer came just as fast, like he had been waiting for the question. I nodded, but in my head something already felt wrong. My father had never been that good at remembering details. Every time he filled out paperwork, he had to ask me to read it back to him. Then I remembered. 3 years ago, my father retired. He sold his hardware store a long time ago. There were no new projects anymore. I looked out the window. One of the men was staring straight at the house. The moment our eyes met, he turned away. I turned back to the table. "If it's that serious," I said, "we should call the police." My father reacted almost immediately. "No, that would only make things worse." I looked at him for a few more seconds, then stood up. The wooden chair scraped lightly across the floor, making a small sound, but it was enough to make everyone in the room look at me. "Then I'll go outside and talk to them," I said. "If all they want is money, then we should at least hear it directly from them." I had only taken 2 steps when my father moved in front of the door. He didn't touch me, but the way he stood there made the way out feel narrower, as if the door had suddenly moved a few steps farther away. "There's no need," he said quickly. "You don't understand those kinds of people." I hadn't even answered yet when a short laugh came from the yard. It wasn't loud, but it was clear in the silence of the house. It didn't sound like the laugh of someone tense or angry. It sounded more like a quick laugh between friends. I looked out the window. One of them was holding a phone, the camera pointed straight at the house. I turned back to the dining table. My mother was still standing behind my chair, both hands gripping the kitchen towel tightly. She looked at my father for a second, then said very softly, almost in a whisper, "We just need her to help this one time." She said it like she was trying to reassure herself, but the word "we" sent a chill down my spine. I looked from my mother to my father, then back to the window. In my head, I started putting the small details together. The answers that came too fast, the avoiding eyes, the badly timed laugh outside. It wasn't that my father was in trouble. It was that maybe I was the problem they were trying to solve. I turned to my father. "You're staging this, aren't you?" The question came out before I had time to think. My father didn't answer right away. He looked at me, then looked out the window. My mother stood behind the chair, both hands still gripping the kitchen towel tightly. Finally, my father let out a sigh. It sounded heavier than I expected. "You have money," he said slowly. "The family needs help." I didn't say anything. I just looked at him. There was no more story in his voice about a business partner, a contract, or men who were not easy to deal with. What was left was a strange kind of bluntness, like the outer layer had just been peeled away. He said they knew I had just sold my shares in a small startup and had savings, and the men outside were just friends of someone he knew, asked to stand there for a little while. My mother turned her face away, as if she didn't want to see my reaction. I looked at the camera on the bookshelf. It had recorded everything from the moment I walked into the house. "Do you know, that camera is live streaming to my cloud? If you're watching up to this point, how do you feel about Evelyn's father? Leave an emoji in the comments." My father didn't say anything for the first few seconds. I saw his eyes flick to the camera on the bookshelf, then back to me, as if he were trying to guess whether I was telling the truth. I pulled out my phone, opened the camera app, and turned the screen toward my parents. The whole room appeared clearly. Everything was being recorded. The audio, too. Every word that had just been said was right there in the video as it played. I held the phone in front of me for a few seconds, then slowly turned the screen toward my parents. "You can watch it again if you want," I said. My mother looked at the screen first. She didn't say anything, but I could see her shoulders stiffen slightly. My father stepped closer, his eyes scanning the video as it played. In the video, his voice had just said, "You have money. The family needs help." He cleared his throat and tried to force a thin smile. "Evelyn, it's just a misunderstanding," he said, his voice softer than before. "We're just talking as a family." I turned off the phone screen and walked to the door. When I opened it, the cold air rushed in. The three men out in the driveway turned their heads almost at the same time. The porch light lit their faces more clearly now. They didn't look anything like men who had come to collect a debt. One of them was still holding a paper coffee cup, and another was leaning back against the pickup truck. I stepped down onto the porch and looked straight at them. "Can I ask you something?" I said, keeping my voice calm. "How much were the three of you paid to stand here?" All three looked at me, then almost at the same time turned toward the door behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know my father was standing just a few steps behind me. A short silence passed. The man standing closest to the front of the truck frowned slightly, as if he were deciding whether he should answer. Finally, he shrugged. $300 each, he said. His voice was casual, not tense at all. Just to stand here for an hour. $300, not $30,000, not some dangerous debt. Just $300 for 1 hour of standing in the yard of a quiet house in Denver. All it takes is one loose link, and the whole story begins to crack. And that night, right there on the front steps of the house where I grew up, the story Harold Bennett had just built started breaking apart piece by piece. The man who had answered looked at me for a few more seconds, as if realizing that what he had just said had completely changed the atmosphere on the porch. He lifted his coffee cup, took a sip, then gave a slight shrug. He said it was just a family joke, he added in a calm voice. I heard that and didn't know whether to laugh or stay quiet. A family joke. Those two words sounded so light they were almost harmless, but set under the porch light with 3 men standing in front of my house, they felt strangely wrong. Before I could say anything, he continued, this time looking straight at me as if he wanted to explain it once and for all. He also said his daughter would pay. He paused for a beat. Because last time she did too. That sentence landed in the driveway like a pebble dropped into a still pond. I didn't answer right away. I just stood there for a few seconds, looking toward the front yard where the pickup truck was parked under the light. The night wind moved softly through the maple trees along the street, dry leaves scraping across the concrete. An old memory suddenly rose in my mind, so clearly that I could almost hear my mother's voice from back then. 5 years earlier, when I had just started a new job in Denver, my parents called and said they needed to borrow a little money to deal with a business problem. Back then, I was younger and believed helping family was simply what you did. I transferred the money without asking many questions. After that, the story slowly faded away, and no one brought it up again. I kept thinking it had just been one hard time. Standing on the porch that night, I began to understand that maybe I had seen everything too simply. I turned and looked back at my father through the open doorway behind me. He was still standing there, the living room light laying a pale yellow streak across his shoulders. His face no longer held the certainty it had at the beginning. And for the first time that night, I understood something clearly. Maybe this wasn't an unexpected situation. Maybe it was a habit. I stood on the porch a few seconds longer, looking at the 3 men in front of me. None of them seemed tense anymore. One of them gave a small shrug, as if both standing there and the story that had just unfolded meant very little to him. I turned and walked back inside. The door closed behind me, cutting off some of the cold Denver night, but it didn't make the room feel any warmer. My father was still standing near the window. At some point, my mother had sat down in the chair, both hands resting on the table as if she were trying to keep them still. I walked past them, pulled out my phone again, reopened the video that had just been recorded, and sent it to a familiar contact, Daniel Harper. He was a lawyer I had known since college, someone who still occasionally helped me review small investment contracts. The message I sent was short. Please save a copy of this for me. I set my phone down on the table. Then I took a neatly folded stack of papers out of my purse. I hadn't prepared it specifically for that night, but I always kept this template in my work bag, a simple personal loan agreement, the kind my insurance company sometimes had to review when handling financial disputes. I opened it and placed it on the table in front of my parents. You said you need money, I said, my voice still calm. If the family truly needs help, we do it this way. My father looked down at the paper for a few seconds. His eyes moved across the neatly printed lines, then stopped at the signature line at the bottom of the page. This is a loan agreement, I continued. There's a deadline, a repayment plan. Everything is clear. My father lifted his head and looked at me, his face hardening. You're turning a family matter into legal paperwork, he said. Do you realize you're destroying this family? I looked at him for a long moment, In my mind flashed the image of the pickup truck in the yard, the 3 men under the porch light, and the words, "Because last time she did too." I shook my head lightly. "No," I said. "You did that first." I folded the papers back up, slipped them into my purse, and headed for the door. As I stepped down onto the porch, the camera on the bookshelf behind me kept recording everything in that room. That night, I drove away from the familiar street in Denver just after 9 p.m. Streetlights slid across the windshield in long streaks. I didn't turn on the radio. In my head, I could still hear my father's voice, the words out in the driveway, and the sound of the wooden door closing behind me. The video from the camera was still on my phone. Daniel had already saved another copy in his system. I didn't watch it again that night. And later on, I didn't either. I never posted that video online. I didn't send it to anyone except Daniel. I didn't use it to make a scene in the family. It simply stayed in a small folder on my phone, like a quiet record of that night. A few days later, relatives in the family started calling to check on me. I understood that the story from that night had spread. Time moved slowly. My job at the insurance company stayed steady. In the mornings, I still drove the familiar road to the office, and in the afternoons, I stopped by the grocery store near home. Life seemed to return to normal. Until one evening, a few weeks later, I was cleaning up the kitchen when my phone gave a soft vibration on the table. My father's name appeared on the screen. I looked at it for a few seconds before answering. There was silence on the other end for a moment. I could hear a light breeze through the microphone, as if he were standing out on the porch. Finally, he said 2 very short words. "I'm sorry." That was all. The truth does not change the past, but it changes the way you move forward. After that call that night, I sat in the kitchen for a long time, not to figure out how I was supposed to feel, just to listen to the quiet I hadn't truly noticed in a long time. I don't hate my parents. That is still true, even after everything that happened. But from that night in the living room, I understood something I had never thought about before. Trust needs boundaries too. Sometimes justice is simply saying, "This will not happen again." My family was never the same after that. Dinners together became less frequent. Phone calls became fewer. There were silences between us that I had never known existed before. The little camera on the bookshelf is still there. I never took it down. Not because I wanted to watch anyone, but because every time I see that tiny green light blinking in the corner of the room, I remember that the truth always finds a way to appear, sometimes very quietly. The story you just heard is a fictional story, created with the help of AI and edited by humans, to offer a reflective perspective on very ordinary situations in family relationships. This content is not meant to encourage anyone to copy the actions in this story. Maybe what the storyteller takes away from Evelyn's story is not who was right or wrong, but something very simple. Sometimes the most important boundary in life is not the boundary with strangers, but the boundary with the people we think we must always give in to. And keeping that boundary does not make you a bad person. Sometimes it simply means you are learning how to protect yourself. If you stayed with this story all the way to the end, I'd truly love to know where you're listening from. What state or city are you in? Leave a comment below. I always enjoy reading and imagining the different places where stories like this are being heard. If Evelyn's story made you think, even a little, please hit like so more people can find this video. And if you enjoy real-life stories like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Thank you for taking the time to listen. And if you'd like, stay a little longer, because there are still many more stories waiting to be told on this channel.